I'm Dan Kubisky, co-chair of the international community of the Society of Professional Journalists. Welcome to what we call IC Shorts. These are 10 to 15-minute updates on issues affecting press freedom around the world. Press freedom advocates around the world have been watching with horror as the Hong Kong government takes more and more actions that limit press freedom. The passage of the national security law puts most of what normal journalists do in jeopardy. The Hong Kong government is also going after the tentative editorial independence Radio Television Hong Kong once enjoyed. Programs are scrapped and news stories pulled if they are out of line with the policies of either the central government in Beijing or the local Hong Kong government. With me today is Francis Moriarty. Francis retired in 2015 after working at RTHK for 19 years as the station's senior political correspondent and weekend assignment editor. Francis also instituted and chaired the awards program for reporting on human rights at the Hong Kong Foreign Correspondents Club. And it was at the FCC where Francis and I met. So welcome, Francis.
Good to see you, Dan.
First, could you please explain the relationship between the Hong Kong government and RTHK? What are, or rather what were, the rules about how much the government could interfere with the news programming at the station, and how have things changed since the passage of the national security law?
Well, I think before we get to the passage of the national security law, we have to look at how things changed in Hong Kong over the decades. RTHK began as a broadcasting service at the end of World War I. And that, of course, was when it was a colony in every way that it could be of the British government. And the station was very much a government department run by the government. There was a government office that produced the news and wrote it, and it was brought over to the station and read by newsreaders. And that was pretty much how the station worked until well after World War II, when the British came back in power. And but it was a recognition that the station had to change because the community was changing. It was increasing in size. It was filled with people who were refugees from mainland China, and there were more of them coming in all the time in response to the traumas and tribulations that were happening in the mainland. And Hong Kong had to develop some sort of identity of its own. That was going to happen anyway. And so the government took the station, which was produced in English, and began increasing program in Cantonese. And it was a big part, it became a big part of forming a Cantonese Hong Kong identity in Hong Kong. And I would make it Hong Kong in a way as distinct from Cantonese. Cantonese is the major language, the major dialect, if you will, that is spoken in Hong Kong. And it's a big part of the identity. And people who came from the mainland, who may originally have spoken Mandarin or some other dialect of Chinese, when they came there, acquired Cantonese. And so there began to be a strong sense of identity with everything in Cantonese culture, Cantonese opera, Cantonese language, and it became a source of strength for the community and identity for the community. So RTHK, Radio Television Hong Kong, began broadcasting in English and in Cantonese. It did have a Mandarin service over time, but it was much smaller. It didn't have the listenership of the Cantonese station. And so you had a split in the station between the English news, which would often be more world or regionally oriented, and the local news, which would be very, very local. And that's what people wanted to hear. And so it had a tool for the use of the community in developing a community-wide identity for the people who were flooding in from mainland China. And over time, this was part of what flowered in the desire for greater autonomy on behalf of the Hong Kong people. So that was something that RTHK served. This did not escape the attention of the communist government on the mainland, who said, you've had a station like this that you've used, you, the British, for all these years. We're going to want to have the same thing. And there was a leftist community, by leftist in this case, we mean pro-communist community in Hong Kong that said, yes, 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 if the Brits had it, we want it. And if they were the colonial power, we in effect are going to be the new colonial power when we come in after 1997. So there was always this spear pointed at RTHK. So the more RTHK began to be trusted by the Hong Kong people to be the main news source for the Hong Kong people, and oddly enough, for a government-funded station, it has always been the single most trusted news source for the people in Hong Kong. It has very high credibility and very high professionalism. And that's what people began to associate with RTHK. When there were threats to RTHK, people felt that that source of truth, that source of independent news disappearing. And so it's been a source of trauma to some degree for the community. The English part of the station, yes, it broadcasts in multiple languages, mainly Cantonese and English. The English side was always treated somewhat apart. And it had a certain, let's just say the leash was longer on the English side. And I think that probably still holds a bit, but the English side is coming under pressure as well. There are people, I am told, who could have had promotions who didn't want to take them because they didn't want the pressures, and because they, even though they were next in line, they may have been foreigners, non-Chinese, who just felt, no, I don't want to do that, and it should be a Chinese anyway, so my Cantonese isn't good enough, blah, blah, blah. And so they have declined promotion and taken other positions. The station is still trying to maintain, those who work in the station are still trying to maintain their sense of independence and quality and professionalism. They are under a great deal of pressure. So it's their task, as I see it, now this is me talking, not them, their struggle is to try to maintain journalistic standards and quality while knowing that there are certain no-go areas or areas that are very sensitive that they will prefer not to touch. Things like June 4th, the anniversary of the Tiananmen massacre in Beijing. That's an example of one. Anything that suggests Hong Kong independence is out. Anything that suggests greater autonomy for Hong Kong right now is out. It's verboten or so loaded. It's a minefield that somebody may not want to walk into without being extremely careful. So that's kind of the situation that we find ourselves in. And what's been happening is that the governing board of RTHK has come under increasingly government control. The government appoints the governing board, but where in the past it would appoint people who had been journalists, sympathetic to journalism, blah, blah, blah. Now they're putting in people who are of a different political stripe and who will basically do what they think the government wants to do. Ideally, the ideal candidate for one of these positions would figure out what the government wanted to do before doing it, and to avoid conflict and make everything smooth and, to use a word that's very current, harmonious. So they've also got people as directors who increasingly are pro, not simply pro-government, they are government officials. And what they call administrative officers, AOs, in Hong Kong. And the AOs are the most promising and usually the most loyal of the bureaucrats. And so they're putting them, people who are trusted and who want to have a career in position, even though they may have no journalistic experience to speak of. They're competent and they're compliant. And that's what's going in charge. So that's the brief story of RTHK and its role in the creation of a Hong Kong identity. Whereas today, the prevailing winds are that we want to have a national identity, a national Chinese identity, not a separate identity that would have the effect inferentially of supporting a sense of Hong Kongness independent of mainland identification.
Okay, so one of the things, you're talking about, government, basically government hacks being put into leadership roles at RTHK. Is there a firewall between the government leadership and the news departments along the lines of what the BBC or the Voice of America enjoy?
Well, I would distinguish between BBC and the Voice of America. I think that VOA has been under a lot of pressure in recent years to make it very much more along the lines of where RTHK is going today.
And there's a lot of us have been fighting that very hard.
and the BBC has its own internal issues as well. But the point is, we had a kind of, I don't want to say it was a firewall, but you had an attitude of professionalism that itself, which you should have anywhere. You know, between the publisher and the editorial floor, there should be some sort of firewall there in any news organization, and that is something that we were developing, a culture of people who were very professional journalists, saw themselves as professional journalists, went to study in other places. We had an exchange program with the BBC, and people would go take courses in the BBC, and we were very much structured, we being RTHK, was very much structured along the BBC lines. So there was a strong professional identity there. That's effectively gone. I think if you wanted to take a course today, you would be well advised to take one at Radio Beijing or something like that, if you were there.
Okay, so your colleagues who are still at the station, your friends, there's really nothing to protect them overtly from pressure to pull a story or to slant a story?
I think they're under implicit pressure, perhaps to slant a story or to remove something. I think you start there, to remove something that could be seen by somebody as a slant.
Okay.
You begin second guessing yourself. That's the name of the game.
Okay, so when I was there, 20 something years ago, the big issue was always self-censorship. And it sounds like this continues to be an issue for the journalists there.
It's always an issue where you have repression.
Okay. All right, so you and I are interested in this issue because, well, you've spent almost 20 years working there.
At RTHK, 30 years in Hong Kong.
Yeah, okay, so even more. The 4 years I was there, I fell in love with the place. I thought it had a great dynamic sense to it, and there was a lot of interesting people. So we're interested in what happens. Why should normal Americans, just everybody else out there, be interested in this particular issue? And maybe also, why should American journalists be concerned about what's happening to RTHK and the press freedom atmosphere in Hong Kong?
Well, there's always a sparrow in the coal mine somewhere. And RTHK happens to be one, but of course, RTHK is still operating. Apple Daily, one of the second largest newspaper in Hong Kong, has been shut down completely. It's gone, right? All those journalists have either had to leave journalism, find other work, or they've had to go abroad. In the first 8 months of this year, from and the end of January onward, there were something like, I think the number was 44,000. No, I'm sorry, it was 88,000 people who left Hong Kong to go abroad, pretty much to Britain, because the government made an offer that so-called British National Overseas BNO passports could be a pathway to citizenship. And so people who thought those BNO passports were basically worthless suddenly realized they had a possibility to them, and they have exercised it and have sought to move abroad. 88,000 people in 8 months is a lot of people to go abroad. And a lot of them have been journalists. A lot of them have been, frankly, people who are facing prosecution under the new national security law. They've fled abroad. And there are business people leaving as well, going to different countries. They don't need a BNO. They may have a passport from someplace else. But there are clearly people who are saying, I can't do business the way I want to, or I feel under pressure. And so some of them are moving as well. So it affects the business community. It affects, you have I don't know what the latest number is, but you've got about 175,000 Americans living in Hong Kong. You've got an even larger number, I think, of Canadians, tens of thousands of British people living there, people with British passports. So it's a world question, and it's a question of how, if this is what happens in China, what's going to happen to Taiwan? Taiwan is not 7 million people, it's 27 million people. And it's a much more complicated question. And it's a country, although people don't want it to, in China, don't want us to call it a country, but it is a self-governing place, which has a lot of freedoms, which is developing better and better courts, and which is electing its own leadership. So what's going to happen with that? And the Chinese are stepping up pressure on that. And I guess this is a larger political point, Dan. The Communist Party of China has to justify, as an unelected party, why they deserve to run China. And they've got basically three things to say. We improve the life of the people, the material life of the people. They're Marxists, so they focus on material. We've made life better for so many people, lifted them out of poverty. Second is we reunified the country because we've got Hong Kong back. We've got Tibet under our control. You can argue whether Tibet was ever part of China, but the Chinese see it that way, and other various little bits and pieces around them. And the great capstone to that would be reacquiring Taiwan and bringing that under mainland control. So you've gotten improved physical conditions. You've got a sense of pride because all these unequal treaties and bad things that were forced on China are being corrected. And then you've got the question of reunification. That's the tripod on which the Chinese Communist Party can justify its control. If it fails in those, it has no mandate. It just has none because it never really has anything approximating an honest election. It's run as a monolithic state and under the control of and leadership of the Communist Party, and that's it. And is that sustainable? I think they have to show progress on those fronts, and if they don't, they become vulnerable. So one of the reasons they're playing so hard with Hong Kong, even though it's small relative to the rest of China, 1.4 billion people and 7 million, is that it cannot risk any cracks in the structure. And Hong Kong would be a big vacuum if it could not exert control the way it feels it should over the affairs of state there.
You know, the handover accord allowed for 50 years of protection of civic and civil rights, which included freedom of speech, freedom of press. But
at least 50 years.
Oh, at least.
Say that at 50 years it ends. It doesn't say the words at least, but it doesn't say that it implies at least, because it doesn't say after 50 years it ends. You know, you look at the writing, there is no reason that one country, two systems could not continue past.
Right. But the problem here now is that we still have a few more years to go before those 50 years hit. And yet we're watching the erosion of civil liberties and civil rights, and including press freedom. How do you react
that 50
to that?
years is gone, Dan.
I'm sorry?
I react by what I just said. That 50 years is gone. It doesn't matter what it says on the calendar. That 50 years is over. Okay. You have what is almost effectively direct control from Beijing now under the national security law, which is not a Hong Kong law. That is a national law of China extended to cover Hong Kong. So that's a whole different ballgame, and it has special courts. It's not the regular courts that you go to. It's a special national security court, and the judges who have accepted positions there accept what the situation is and exercise it accordingly. So you're seeing some very, very stiff sentences handed down to the people who are showing up in court. And you've had thousands of arrests, and you've had hundreds of charges, and you've got many that's still outstanding. And and you're getting some very tough, I would say, even draconian sentences. So it's China has taken a big foot and put it right down on Hong Kong. And big-footed, I think, would be the right term. They haven't sent the army in, although there are army units there, we know, but they haven't had to use them yet. They don't want to have a repeat of Tiananmen, that's for sure. But they're managing to accomplish what they want to accomplish without it. I mean, they have spent many, many decades studying the system, studying laws, and figuring out how they can do all of this and make it look like it's a rule of law with courts and judges, and it's all somehow normal, and people can still do business. And there's lots of people who say, well, as long as I can do business, and as long as I can trade, and as long as I can get my money in the bank and get it out of the bank, I'm fine. I avoid all that political stuff. But to people who care about freedom, it's another issue.
Yeah, just thinking of the title of one of the Larry Fine's books, just shut up and let's all shut up and make money, from the old Lily Wong series.
Right. Well, I think a lot of cartoonists have disappeared.
Mm-hmm.
You almost don't see cartoons in newspapers anymore, because sarcasm has no place. I mean, the Communist Party of China is not a group of people who like to dress up in funny hats and big noses and jump out from behind the closet door. This is not a fun group who likes surprises. This is not them at all. And so cartoons and satire and sarcasm are verboten. You don't get that. If you do a cartoon for one of the communist papers, it's very pointed. It's very, usually, frankly, rather crude. And there's no irony. I think they realize when emperors have no clothes, it's not a good idea to have fashion shows.
For people who didn't get the reference to Larry Fine and Lily Wong, I'll put a link.
Larry Fine wouldn't get that. Yeah,
I'll put a link in the comment or in the explanation section when this gets posted on YouTube, so people will be able to take a look.
Some of Larry Fane's cartoons were very funny, and some of Larry Fane's cartoons were perhaps quite in the past in certain respects.
Right. Oh yeah.
It's been played on stereotypes. So I think that, some of it could have been modernized without any loss. But the point is, the larger point is press freedom, and cartoons and sarcasm and skewering people is a time-honored part of journalism, and that's just not there.
Right. But I want to go back to the second part of the question I got, where we got started with all this. Why should Americans care? And why should I'm sorry?
If you care about the Constitution of the United States, you care about the principles it was founded on. If you believe that a country with freedom is a better place than a country without freedom, you should care. If you care if you are a person who's ideologically oriented, and you think that communism is not a terrific way to organize a society, or at least communism as it is practiced there and in one or two other places we can think of, you might think that's just not the way a society should go. People should be able to determine their own lives as much as possible. They should be able to determine their own society. They should be able to determine their own laws. They should be able to elect their own legislators. If you believe in those principles, then you should care about what's happening in Hong Kong, and you should care no less about what is happening in Taiwan. Taiwan was an issue when we were young boys, and we heard John Kennedy and Richard Nixon debating the issue that took all the headlines, dominated that debate, were two little places called Quemoy and Matsu. And today you don't hear the word Quemoy at all. And Matsu is usually Minzu and another name. And they're two tiny little specks that nobody discusses. Taiwan is the big issue. And that's a good sized place, 100 miles off the coast of mainland China, with 27 million folks on it. And these are people, many of whom go to school in the United States or went to school in the United States or dream of going to school in the United States, operate a free enterprise system, have courts that are significantly improving over time over what they used to be, because the former head, the late head Chiang Kai-shek, who founded his government in Taiwan, was basically a dictator. And it took a long time to push aside that structure as well, and to get a structure that is directly elected. And now you have that, and people vote in and they vote out, and if you've seen that country over decades, which I have, you see the enormous progress that's been made in the quality of life of the people. I mean, the cities don't look anything at all like what they used to look. The air pollution doesn't look anything at all like what it used to look. It is a much more beautiful and largely well-run city. Whichever party runs it, some of those mayors are really good. And they've had some very good local control over local issues. And you see trees and parks and high-speed railroads. And it's just an enormous change for people who've known it over that period of time. We should care about those places. They emulate what our image is to them. I'm not sure we're always living up these days to our image, but they're trying to. And I think that they deserve our support.
We could go on and make this a whole IC talk going on for more than an hour. But I do want to keep it short. Okay.
I'll go talk as long as you will.
We'll have you on for a longer discussion, Francis. I promise. Okay.
Happy to come visit too.
You come down. You're more than welcome. But there is one last question I want to ask you, and we ask this of all of our guests. What does press freedom mean to you?
I think it's very difficult for me to imagine having democracy without having press freedom. Hong Kong has tried to have press freedom without having complete political freedom, and it hasn't worked. So if you want to see an object lesson in what happens if you try to have the freedoms, but you don't have the underpinning structure, look at Hong Kong. I think if you want to have a functioning democracy, you've got to have a free press. Is any press totally free? We can have that debate for hours, but we should be free to have the debate. And
Wow.
Right now in Hong Kong, you're not going to get that.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Francis, thank you very much.
Sure, my pleasure.
For taking the time. And for people watching this video, if you want more information about the situation in Hong Kong and other press freedom issues, please feel free to get in touch with the Society of Professional Journalists International Community at spj.internationalcommunity, make that one word, at gmail.com. Again, Francis, thank you very much for your time. We really do appreciate it. And we will have you back on for a much longer discussion about all these great issues that you raised today.
Well, I hope that people will take the time to look up something called the Hong Kong Press Freedom Awards. They used to be every year. This would have been their 25th year, Dan, but they'll happen in another form, in another place, because the big arm of the law came down with the national security law, and it was decided that Amnesty International, the local chapter, would basically disappear and would not be taking part. And the FCC is basically hived it off to the Hong Kong University, which I'm very pleased to say is still going to try to keep going. But it's a huge loss, and it's a loss for press freedom all over Asia, because those awards honor journalism, high quality journalism from all over the Asia region, and now that's not going to be there. So it's a loss for everybody.
And we have included links in the past when the Foreign Correspondents Club was doing the awards. We will be including the links for people to see the awards program over at, it's a HKU, Hong Kong University, correct? Yeah.
Yep.
Okay, so we
No,
will
thank you for that.
keep promoting that. Again, thank you very much, Francis.
My pleasure.